The road was little more than a ribbon of gravel twisting through the English countryside, the late afternoon sun spilling gold across the fields, while the shadows of ancient oaks stretched long and thin. The air was heavy with the scent of rain that had not yet fallen, and each step toward the barn felt like walking deeper into a memory. The structure stood alone, its wooden panels warped and grey, its roof sagging under the weight of years. A rusted padlock clung to the door as if it had been waiting for decades for this moment, when the metal finally gave way. The hinges groaned a low sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil and dust, and something older. A silence so complete it pressed against my ears. A single beam of light slipped through a crack in the roof and landed on a curve of metal, smooth even under the dust, a shape that spoke of speed and elegance. I stepped closer, my fingers brushing away decades of neglect to reveal the unmistakable lines of a Jaguar E Type. The tires were flat, the paint dulled to a ghost of its former color, but the body was whole. It felt less like I had found a car and more like I had woken something that had been sleeping for half a century in the driver's seat. A cracked leather journal weighted its pages, yellowed and curling at the edges. The first words I read were not about racing or roads, but about nights at the docks. Fog rolling in thick and cold, and one word repeated again and again. Consignment. The barn seemed to exhale as I closed the book, and in that moment I knew this was not just a discovery, it was the beginning of a story someone had tried very hard to keep buried. The rain had been falling since before dawn, a steady whisper against the roof that made the world outside feel distant and unreachable. The journal lay open on my desk, its pages breathing faintly in the draft that slipped through the old window. The ink on this entry was darker, heavier, as though the hand that wrote it had been pressed by urgency or fear. It spoke of a shipment leaving Southampton bound for Halifax, a route that crossed the cold Atlantic into waters where storms could swallow ships whole, but the date was wrong. It did not match the brittle newspaper clipping I had found in the glove box of the Jaguar, the one that told of a fire at the docks that same week, a fire with no recorded cause. I read the lines again, tracing the words with my fingertips until I felt something beneath the paper, a shallow indentation, the ghost of writing that had been torn away. The missing page left only a shadow of its message. The next entry mentioned a man known only by his initials R.H., always at the docks. Always watching. The handwriting here was smaller, tighter, as if the words themselves were afraid to be seen. Outside, the wind rose and the rain struck harder. The glass of the window shimmered with the reflection of my study lamp, and for a moment I thought I saw movement behind me, a shape that did not belong. I turned quickly. The room was empty, but the journal had shifted. It now sat closer to me than before. I told myself it was the wind, but the window was closed. I leaned back, listening to the rain and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. The sound seemed louder than it should have been, each tick stretching into the next, until it felt like time itself was slowing. I turned another page and found a sketch drawn in hurried strokes. It showed the outline of a ship, its name smudged beyond recognition, and in the corner a small mark like a signature. But not quite, it was a symbol, a circle broken by a single line through its center. I had seen it before, though I could not remember where. The memory hovered just out of reach, like a word on the tip of the tongue. The rain outside shifted to a heavier rhythm, and somewhere in the distance, a low horn sounded deep and mournful, as if calling across the years. I closed the journal, but the symbol stayed in my mind, and with it a feeling I could not shake, that the car in the barn and the man with the initials R.H. were only the surface of something far larger, something that had been waiting for me long before I ever stepped onto that gravel road. The morning broke under a sky the color of tarnished silver. The rain had eased, but the air still carried the weight of last night's storm. The fields beyond my window glistened with a thin sheen of water, and the hedgerows dripped steadily, as if reluctant to let go of the night I had left the journal closed on the desk. Yet when I entered the study, it lay open to a page I did not remember turning. The handwriting here was jagged, uneven, the ink blotting in places as though the pen had been dragged by a trembling hand. It spoke of a meeting at the edge of the harbour, a place where the fog rolled in so thick it swallowed the lamps and muffled the sound of the sea. The writer mentioned a crate marked only with the same broken circle symbol I had seen before, and a warning written in the margin, "Do not let him see you." I could almost hear the gulls and the slap of water against the pilings as I read the words, the image so vivid it felt less like imagination and more like memory. The next lines were stranger, still describing a figure who never stepped fully into the light, a man whose face was always turned away, and whose shadow seemed longer than it should be. The initials RH appeared again this time, followed by a single word, payment. I closed the journal and the room seemed smaller, the air tighter, as if the walls had leaned in a fraction. I decided to walk to the barn to clear my head. The gravel crunched under my boots, and the wind carried the faint scent of salt. Though the sea was miles away, the barn door resisted my push, as though something inside pressed back when it finally gave. The Jaguar sat exactly as before. Yet the beam of light from the roof now fell across the passenger seat, and there on the cracked leather lay a small brass key, one I was certain had not been there yesterday. It was cold to the touch, and heavier than it looked. Etched into its head was the same broken circle. I stood there listening to the quiet, but it was not the same quiet as before. This one felt aware, as if the barn itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to decide whether to turn the key or walk away. The day felt colder than it should have been, the kind of cold that settles in your bones, even without the wind. The sky hung low and heavy, the color of pewter, and the light that filtered through the clouds was thin and tired. I kept the brass key in my pocket, its weight a constant reminder of the choice I had not yet made. The broken circle etched into its head, pressed against my palm whenever I touched it, as if it wanted to be remembered. I walked back to the barn that afternoon, the gravel crunching under my boots in a rhythm that matched the slow thud of my heartbeat. The air inside was still but not empty. It felt as though the space was aware of me. The Jaguar sat in its place, the dust on its bonnet disturbed only where my hand had brushed it days before. I moved to the passenger side and slid the key into my pocket deeper, as if hiding it from the car itself. The journal was gone. I stood there staring at the empty seat, the cracked leather now bare, the absence louder than any sound I could imagine. I searched the floor, the dashboard, even the boot, but there was nothing, only the faint smell of salt, stronger now than it had been before, as though the sea had crept closer in the night. When I stepped outside, the wind carried a sound that did not belong here, a low horn, deep and mournful, the same I had heard in my mind when I first saw the symbol on the page. It came again, longer this time, and I realized it was not in my mind at all. It was real, and it was coming from somewhere beyond the fields. I followed the sound through the hedgerows and down a narrow path I had never noticed before. The ground grew softer underfoot, and the air damp with the scent of water, until I reached a clearing where an old canal cut through the land, its surface dark and still. Moored at the far bank was a boat, its paint peeling its name obscured by grime, but on its bow, carved deep into the wood, was the broken circle. A figure stood on the deck, watching me, unmoving, the distance between us filled with the weight of unspoken recognition. I could not see his face, but I knew without knowing how that this was RH, and that the key in my pocket was meant for something on that boat, something that had been waiting for me far longer than I had been looking for it. The canal was still when I returned the next morning, its surface a sheet of dull glass that reflected the low grey sky. The boat was gone, leaving only the faint ripple of its passing, and the smell of diesel hanging in the damp air. I stood at the bank, listening for the horn, but the silence was complete, the kind of silence that feels deliberate, as if the world itself had decided to hold its breath. The brass key in my pocket felt heavier than before, its edges pressing into my palm until I closed my fist around it. I walked back toward the barn, the path narrower than I remembered, the hedgerows leaning in as though they meant to hide me from something, or hide something from me. The barn door opened without resistance this time, and the light inside was different, softer, almost golden, as if the dust itself had begun to glow. The Jaguar sat waiting, its curves catching the light in a way that made it seem alive. The passenger seat where the journal had been was still empty, but on the dashboard lay a folded scrap of paper. I unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was the same as in the journal, sharp and deliberate. It contained only 3 words: "Bring it tonight." I did not need to ask what it meant. The key in my pocket seemed to warm at the thought the message had no signature, but in the corner was the broken circle symbol drawn so faintly it might have been missed by anyone not looking for it. I stepped back from the car, and the air in the barn shifted a faint creak from the rafters, a whisper of movement in the shadows above. Outside the clouds had thickened, and the first drops of rain began to fall. I knew that whatever waited tonight would not be found in the safety of daylight. It would be in the dark by the water, where the fog could hide more than it revealed, and where the truth might finally step out of the shadows or pull me into them. The night came down heavy and slow, the kind of darkness that feels like it has weight. The fog rolled in from nowhere, swallowing the hedgerows and softening the edges of the world, until even the barn seemed like a shadow of itself. I kept the brass key in my hand, its cold pressing into my skin, as if reminding me it was more than metal, more than a tool. It was a promise or a threat. The note from the dashboard burned in my pocket. Bring it tonight. The words had no signature, but they didn't need one. The broken circle was enough. I walked the gravel path toward the canal. The sound of my boots muffled by the fog. The air smelled of salt and diesel, though the water was still hidden from view. When I reached the clearing, the boat was there again, its hull dark against the pale mist. A faint light glowed in the cabin, and a figure stood on the deck, unmoving, watching me the same as before. I could not see his face, but I knew it was RH. The air between us felt stretched thin, like a rope pulled too tight. I stepped onto the narrow wooden jetty, the boards creaking under my weight. The water below was black and still. The figure raised a hand, not in greeting, but in command. I stopped halfway, the key heavy in my palm. He pointed toward the cabin door and then to the pocket where the note lay, as if to say, "You know why you're here." The fog thickened until the world beyond the boat ceased to exist. I took the last steps onto the deck. The wood slick beneath my boots, the figure stepped aside, letting me pass into the cabin. The air inside was warmer but carried the same scent of salt and oil. A single lantern swung gently, casting shadows that moved like they were alive. On the table lay a small iron box, its surface etched with the broken circle. The key fit perfectly into the lock, and as it turned, something shifted in the air outside. The lantern flame trembled. The figure at the door leaned closer, as if to see what I would do next, and in that moment I realized whatever was inside this box was the reason the Jaguar had been hidden, the reason the journal existed, and the reason someone had been waiting for me long before I ever knew this story had begun. The fog had not lifted since the night on the boat. It clung to the fields and hedgerows like a living thing, curling around fence posts and swallowing the road ahead. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint tang of salt. Even though the sea was still miles away, I had not slept. The brass key lay on the table beside me, its broken circle catching the weak morning light. Like an unblinking eye, I kept thinking of the iron box and the way the lantern flame had trembled when I turned the key, though I had not yet opened it. By midday, I could no longer sit still. The barn drew me back, as if the Jaguar itself was calling. The door opened easily. The dust inside seemed disturbed, as though someone had walked here recently. The car sat in its place, but the driver's door was ajar, and on the seat lay a single photograph. Its edges curled with age. It showed the Jaguar gleaming new, parked beside the same canal boat I had seen in the fog, and standing between them was a man whose face was turned just enough to hide his features, but the initials RH were stitched into the breast of his jacket. I turned the photograph over and found an address written in the same sharp hand as the journal. It was a street I knew in the old Docklands, a place where the warehouses leaned over the water and the gulls cried all day. I pocketed the photo and the key and set out. The sky darkened as I walked, the streets narrowing until the buildings seemed to press in on either side. The address led me to a warehouse with boarded windows and a door painted the same dull red as dried blood. The door was unlocked, the air inside heavy with the smell of rope and salt and something metallic. The light was dim, filtering through cracks in the boards, and in the center of the room sat a table, and on it the iron box, exactly as it had been on the boat, the broken circle glinting faintly in the gloom. I stepped closer, and the boards creaked under my weight. Somewhere above me, a footstep answered, and I realized I was not alone. The air inside the warehouse was colder than the docklands outside, the kind of cold that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The iron box sat on the table exactly where I had seen it on the boat, its surface dull, except for the broken circle that caught the thin light leaking through the boarded windows. I could hear the faint drip of water somewhere in the shadows, and the slow groan of the building settling as if it too was watching. I stepped closer, the floorboards flexing under my weight. The key in my hand felt almost warm now, as though it had been waiting for this moment. I slid it into the lock and turned. The sound was louder than it should have been, echoing in the empty space. The lid lifted with surprising ease, and inside was not gold or jewels or anything that could be sold, but a bundle of letters bound with a strip of oil-stained cloth, each envelope marked with dates spanning more than 50 years. The top letter was addressed to a name I did not recognize, but the return address was the barn, the same barn where the Jaguar had slept for decades. I unfolded the paper, and the handwriting was the same sharp, deliberate style as the journal. The words spoke of shipments and routes of storms weathered and ports avoided, but between the lines there were phrases that felt like warnings or codes. The last line read simply, "The car is the map." A sound came from above, a slow, deliberate step across the beams. I looked up but saw only darkness. Then another step closer. This time I could feel the vibration through the floor. I slid the letters back into the box and turned toward the door, but a figure was already there, blocking the light from outside. Tall shoulders, squared face hidden in shadow. The smell of salt and diesel clung to him, and in his hand he held the photograph I had found in the Jaguar. Without a word, he placed it on the table beside the box and tapped the broken circle with one finger, as if to say, "You still do not understand," before the light shifted, and he was gone, leaving only the sound of the dripping water and the weight of the key still in my hand. The warehouse felt emptier than it had the night before, yet the air was thicker, as if it carried the weight of something unseen. The letters from the iron box were still in my bag, their paper dry, but their words heavy. I kept hearing that last line, "The car is the map." It repeated in my head, like the slow toll of a distant bell. I left the building, and the docklands swallowed me, the narrow streets slick with rain, the lamps casting pale halos in the mist. Back at the barn, the Jaguar waited, its shape half lost in shadow. I circled it slowly, my hand trailing along the cold metal until I reached the boot. The key slid into the lock with a resistance that felt almost deliberate. The lid lifted, and inside was nothing but the original tool roll neatly wrapped in faded canvas. I unrolled it, and there, between the spanners and screwdrivers, was a strip of oil-stained parchment covered in lines and markings. It was not a repair diagram, it was a map. The lines were not roads but waterways, twisting and branching like veins across a body. At the center was a small mark. The broken circle, the same symbol etched into the key, and the iron box. I traced the route with my finger and realized it began here in Oxfordshire and ended at a point far to the north on a stretch of coast known for shipwrecks and fog. A sound came from outside the barn, the crunch of gravel under slow, deliberate steps. I closed the boot and stepped into the shadows. The door creaked open, and a figure entered, moving with the certainty of someone who belonged here. The lantern light caught the edge of his jacket and the stitched initials RH. He looked at the Jaguar, then at me, and for the first time I saw his face. It was older than I expected, lined by years and weather, but his eyes were sharp and unblinking. He spoke only once before turning to leave. "Midnight at the water, or the map dies with you." The night settled over Oxfordshire like a slow tide, swallowing the last traces of daylight, the fog rising from the fields until the hedgerows became little more than pale shapes in the dark. I left the barn with the map folded deep in my coat, the brass key in my pocket, and the words of RH still in my ears. "Midnight at the water, or the map dies with you." The road to the canal felt longer than it had before, each step muffled by the damp earth, the air heavy with the smell of salt and something faintly metallic. When I reached the clearing, the boat was waiting, its hull black against the pale mist, a single lantern swaying at the bow, casting a trembling path of light across the water. RH stood on the deck, his face half in shadow, his eyes fixed on me without greeting. He turned and stepped into the cabin, leaving the door open as if expecting me to follow. Inside, the air was warmer but close. The iron box sat on the table, the letters gone in their place, a rolled chart bound with twine. I untied it slowly, the paper crackling under my fingers. It was another map, but this one was different. The waterways were marked with symbols I had never seen before, and at the farthest point north, the broken circle was drawn larger than I had ever seen it beneath it. In small, precise letters was a date 3 days from now. R.H. watched me without speaking, then reached into his coat and placed a small object on the table. It was a compass, but the needle spun slowly as if searching for something unseen. He slid it toward me, and for the first time I heard his voice, low and deliberate. "The car will take you there, but the sea will decide if you return," before I could ask what he meant. The lantern flickered. The boat shifted underfoot, and when I looked up, he was gone, leaving only the sound of water lapping against the hull and the map between my hands. The fog had thickened by the time I left the boat. The map and compass wrapped carefully inside my coat, the streets of the Docklands were slick with rain, and the lamps along the quay burned like pale moons in the mist. I walked without hurry, yet every step felt measured, as though the ground itself was counting them. The words of R.H. echoed in my mind. "The car will take you there, but the sea will decide if you return." When I reached the barn, the Jaguar waited in silence, its chrome catching the faintest glint from the open door. I slid into the driver's seat, the leather cold beneath me, and placed the compass on the dash. The needle spun lazily before settling not north, but toward the coast. I turned the key, and the engine came alive with a low growl that seemed far too smooth for a machine that had slept for decades. The road out of Oxfordshire was empty, the hedgerows blurring into shadows as the car moved faster than I intended. The compass needle quivered, but held its direction, pulling me towards something unseen miles past, in a haze of wet tarmac and ghostly light, until the land began to change. The air grew sharper, the scent of salt stronger, and the sound of waves reached me long before I saw the water. At the edge of the coast, the road ended in a crumbling stretch of concrete that jutted into the sea. The compass needle pointed straight ahead into the black water. I stepped out, the wind cutting through my coat, and in the distance, through the rolling fog, I saw a faint light, low to the surface, moving slowly, as if it were waiting for me. I turned back toward the Jaguar and saw that the map on the passenger seat was no longer folded. It was open, and on it a new line had been drawn, one that ended exactly where I now stood. The wind off the water was sharper here, carrying with it the taste of salt and the faint metallic tang of rusted iron. The fog moved in slow coils across the crumbling concrete pier, wrapping itself around the Jaguar. Like a living thing, the map lay open on the passenger seat, its lines glistening faintly, as though the ink itself had absorbed the damp air. The compass on the dash spun, once then settled, pointing straight toward the black expanse of sea ahead. I stepped out, my boots scraping against the grit and broken shells scattered across the pier. The waves below moved with a strange rhythm, not quite in time with the wind, as if something beneath the surface was dictating their pace. Far out in the mist, a light appeared, low and steady, moving toward me. It was not the swaying glow of a fishing boat, but something fixed, deliberate. The sound reached me next, a deep, slow pulse, like the beat of a heart too large to belong to anything human. I glanced back at the Jaguar and saw that the headlamps had flickered on without my touch, their beams cutting narrow tunnels through the fog, illuminating the edge of the pier where the concrete ended in jagged ruin. I followed the light along the water's edge until I reached a set of stone steps, slick with moss, leading down to a narrow landing half submerged in the tide. There, tied to a rusted ring, was a small wooden skiff, its paint peeling, its oars resting inside as though waiting for me. The broken circle was carved into the bow, deep and precise. I stepped in the boat, the wood groaning under my weight. The oars felt cold and damp in my hands. The light ahead remained steady, drawing me out into the fog. The shore vanished behind me, swallowed whole by the mist, and for the first time since the barn, I felt the weight of the story pressing in from all sides, as if every mile of water was pulling me closer to the truth and further from any way back. The fog on the open water was thicker than anything I had seen before. It clung to the surface in slow, shifting layers, swallowing the oars and the bow of the skiff until I could barely see my own hands. The only sound was the steady drip of water from the oarlocks and the faint pulse of that low, deep rhythm I had first heard from the pier. The light ahead remained fixed and unwavering, drawing me further from the shore until the land was nothing but a memory. The compass lay on the bench beside me, its needle spinning slowly, then pausing as if it too was uncertain of the way the map in my coat felt heavier with each pull of the oars, as though the paper itself was absorbing the damp and the weight of the journey. The air grew colder, the salt sharper, and beneath it all was another scent, faint but unmistakable, oil and metal. Through the fog, a shape began to form low and wide on the water, its outline blurred by the mist. It was not a ship, not in the way I expected. It was a platform of some kind, anchored to the sea itself. The broken circle was painted across its surface, so large it could be seen even through the shifting grey. I tied the skiff to a rusted cleat and stepped onto the platform, the wood slick beneath my boots. The sound of the sea changed here, muted, as if the water itself was holding back. I moved toward the centre, where a hatch lay flush with the boards, its handle cold and wet. Under my hand, the brass key slid into the lock with a perfect fit, and as it turned, the deep pulse I had been hearing grew louder, vibrating through the boards into my bones. The hatch lifted slowly, revealing a narrow stairway descending into darkness. The air that rose to meet me was warmer, carrying with it the smell of salt and something older, something that had been waiting far below the surface for far longer than I had been alive. I stepped down the first stair, and the hatch closed above me, sealing the light away, leaving only the sound of the sea and the slow, steady beat that now felt like it was coming from the heart of the world itself. The stairway was narrow and steep, the wood damp beneath my hands. As I descended each step, groaning softly under my weight, the air grew warmer with every foot I dropped, carrying the scent of salt and something older than the sea itself. The deep pulse I had heard above was louder here, vibrating through the walls and into my chest, until it felt like my own heartbeat had fallen into its rhythm. At the bottom, the passage opened into a chamber carved directly into the rock, the walls slick with moisture and glistening in the dim light of a single lantern. Set on a rusted table in the center of the room sat another box, larger than the iron one above its surface, covered in the same broken circle symbol repeated over and over like a warning or a seal. The brass key in my pocket seemed to grow heavier as I stepped closer. I reached for the lid, but stopped when I noticed the floor around the table was marked with faint lines, like the outline of something that had once been there and had been moved recently. The pulse in the air shifted slightly faster now, as if aware of my hesitation. I turned slowly, scanning the shadows, and saw that the chamber was not empty. In the far corner, half hidden by the curve of the wall, stood R.H., his coat damp, his eyes fixed on me. He said nothing, but in his hand he held the journal, the same one that had vanished from the Jaguar. Days ago, he placed it gently on the table beside the box and stepped back into the shadows, his voice low and steady. When it came, open it, and you will see why the car was never meant to be found. The lantern flickered, the shadows deepened, and the pulse in the walls became a steady roar as I reached for the lid, knowing that whatever was inside would change the shape of the story forever. The roar in the walls had become a living thing by the time my hands closed around the lid of the larger box. The lantern's light trembled across the slick stone walls, and the air felt charged as if the chamber itself was holding its breath. The brass key turned with a slow, reluctant click, and the lid lifted on hinges that groaned like something waking from a long sleep. Inside was not treasure, not gold or jewels, but a single object wrapped in oil-darkened cloth. I unwrapped it slowly, the fabric clinging to itself until it fell away, revealing a small mechanical device no larger than my palm, its surface etched with the broken circle and a series of numbers worn almost smooth with age. It was cold to the touch, yet I could feel a faint vibration running through it in time with the pulse in the walls. R.H. stepped forward from the shadows, his eyes fixed on the device, his voice low and deliberate. That is the heart without it. The map is nothing. He reached into his coat and placed the journal beside the box, open to a page I had never seen before. The handwriting was hurried. The ink smeared, but the words were clear. The car will lead you to the shore. The heart will open the way, but the sea will take its due. Before I could speak, the lantern flickered and went out, plunging the chamber into darkness. The pulse grew louder, filling my head until it was all I could hear. I felt R.H.'s hand close around my arm, guiding me toward the stairs. His grip firm but not unkind. When we reached the hatch above, the air was colder, sharper, the fog pressing in, as if it had been waiting for us. The Jaguar sat at the edge of the pier, its headlamps cutting narrow tunnels through the mist. The device in my hand seemed to hum in answer to the engine's low growl, and in that moment I understood that whatever lay ahead would not wait for daylight, and that the final part of this journey would demand more than I had yet given. The fog was thicker than I had ever seen it, the world reduced to a shifting wall of grey that swallowed the pier, the sea, and even the sound of the wind. The Jaguar idled at the edge of the concrete, its headlamps cutting narrow tunnels through the mist. The small mechanical device in my hand pulsed faintly in time with the deep rhythm I had first heard beneath the platform. R.H. stood beside the car, his coat dark with moisture, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if he could see something I could not. Without a word, he opened the passenger door, and I slid inside, the leather cold against my back. The engine's growl deepened as he took the wheel. The compass on the dash spun, once then locked, pointing toward the black water ahead. We drove not along the road but down the crumbling pier, the tires hissing over wet stone until the front of the car met the edge of the sea, and yet we did not stop. The water rose around the wheels, the fog closing in, until the world beyond the bonnet ceased to exist. The device in my hand grew warmer, its vibrations stronger, and then with a shudder, the Jaguar began to sink, not with the violence of drowning, but with the slow inevitability of something returning home. The light from the headlamps reached only a few feet before being swallowed by the dark. When the water closed over the roof, there was no panic, only the steady pulse, and the faint glow from the device guiding us downward. Shapes moved in the gloom, vast and slow, their outlines just beyond recognition. The pressure built in my ears and then eased as if we had passed through something unseen. The darkness thinned and a pale light bloomed ahead, revealing structures rising from the seabed, arches and walls carved with the broken circle over and over. The Jaguar rolled to a stop before a great gate of stone. The device in my hand flared once with blinding light, and the gate began to open. The pulse became a roar, the water around us trembling as if the sea itself was breathing. And in that moment I understood the truth. The car had never been just a machine. It was the key, and the journey had never been about finding it, but about bringing it back to where it had always belonged. The fog pressed in tighter around the Jaguar as the great stone gate yawned open. The pale light spilling out was not sunlight, but something older, deeper. It poured across the seabed in slow waves, illuminating carvings that seemed to shift when I looked too long. The device in my hand pulsed faster, and for the first time I understood the words from the journal, "The sea will take its due." It was not a warning about storms or tides. It was a bargain, something given long ago. In exchange for passage and safe return, the sea had kept its part for decades, guarding the heart, the map, the car, but now it was time to collect its payment, and payment was never in gold. The Jaguar rolled forward through the gate, the light swallowing us whole, and in that moment I saw shapes moving in the glow, vast and slow, their outlines older than ships, older than the coastlines themselves. One of them turned, and I felt its gaze pass through the steel, the glass, the skin and bone, until it found the truth I carried. The device in my hand grew hot, the pulse became a roar, and then everything went silent. The light, the shapes, the gate gone as if they had never been there. I was back on the pier, the Jaguar idling quietly, the fog lifting just enough to show the empty sea ahead. The device was gone, only the brass key remained cold and still in my palm. Somewhere out beyond the horizon, the deep rhythm began again, faint but certain, and I knew the bargain was not finished. The sea had taken something, and in time it would come for the rest, coming soon. Season 2. The tide always returns. But not everything it carries back is meant for the shore.